Sterling Vance threw Jason's old leather book back at him and told him the bank didn't accept antiques. Jason Watkins stood there with his worn briefcase, looking completely out of place among all the wealthy people in expensive suits. He had come to claim a trust fund his great-grandfather established in 1923, and he had all the original documents to prove it. But Sterling Vance just laughed at him, and so did everyone else in the lobby. They all thought he was crazy, showing up with handwritten ledgers and an old metal seal, trying to claim money from 100 years ago. None of them knew that Jason wasn't there to ask for anything. He was there to take back the entire bank that his family had founded. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and it proves that powerful stories resonate everywhere. Jason Watkins entered the Meridian Financial Hub on a Tuesday morning. The building was massive and modern, with glass walls and marble floors. Everything inside was expensive and high-tech. Digital screens showed stock prices and cryptocurrency values. Young professionals rushed around with their phones, doing business deals and checking their accounts. Jason didn't belong there. His suit was old and cheap. His briefcase was from his grandfather's era, made of cracked leather with tarnished brass buckles. Nobody noticed him when he walked in because he looked so ordinary and out of place. He went to the teller counter and spoke to a woman named Melissa. He told her he needed to access a trust account that had been inactive for 50 years. Melissa was confused because the bank's computer records only went back 20 years. Jason explained that he had brought the original documentation. He pulled out an old leather ledger book filled with handwritten entries from 1923. Melissa didn't know what to do with it. She told him the bank needed digital documents, not old books. Jason gave her the account number, 00-0000-1847. She typed it into her computer, but nothing came up. The account didn't exist in the system. That's when Sterling Vance arrived. He was a lead auditor, a man in his 30s who wore expensive suits and had perfectly styled hair. He represented everything modern about banking, digital systems, blockchain technology, efficiency. When he saw Jason's leather ledger, he immediately became amused and condescending. Vance picked up the book and mocked it openly. He asked Jason if he thought the bank would process claims based on antique books and fairy tales. He told Jason that people came in all the time claiming to be owed millions based on family stories and fake documents. Vance assumed Jason was either delusional or running a scam. Jason remained calm. He explained that his great-grandfather, Nathaniel Watkins, had established a trust in 1923. The account was designed to compound annually based on gold prices, and it could only be accessed by direct descendants who possessed the founder's seal. When Jason mentioned the founder's seal, Vance laughed even harder. The people in the lobby started watching and recording on their phones. Vance was turning Jason's claim into public entertainment, humiliating him in front of everyone. Jason then pulled out a brass medallion, the founder's seal. It was old and tarnished with an engraved building and initials MW on one side and the account number on the other. Vance looked at it and laughed louder. He held it up for everyone to see, suggesting Jason had probably bought it at a flea market for $5. The crowd found this hilarious. But then Jason said something that made everyone stop laughing. He mentioned Vault Zero, the original vault from when the bank was founded in 1919. He explained that before it was called Meridian Financial, it had been Meridian Savings and Trust, and before that, Watkins and Meridian First Bank. His great-grandfather had been one of the two founders. Vance's amusement faded. Jason continued explaining the history. He said that Nathaniel Watkins and Robert Meridian had built the bank using gold reserves from the Watkins family's California mining operations. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, those gold reserves had kept the bank from collapsing. In exchange, Nathaniel had established a perpetual trust that would compound forever. Vance tried to dismiss this as a nice story, but Jason wasn't finished. He pulled out a certified copy of the original trust agreement from 1923. It showed the signatures and official seals. Vance's confidence started to crack when he saw it. Jason then revealed that he was a financial history professor at the university. He had spent 5 years researching his family's connection to the bank. He knew every merger, every acquisition, every name change in the bank's history. He explained that when Meridian Financial purchased Meridian Savings and Trust in 1987, they had inherited all existing legal obligations, including the Watkins Trust. Then Jason stated the number, $35 million. That's what the original $50,000 gold deposit had grown to over nearly 100 years of compound interest. The lobby went completely silent. Vance's expression changed from mockery to worry. Jason wasn't some confused old man with family legends. He was a historian with legal documentation, and he had just made a legitimate $35 million claim against the bank. Vance told Jason to wait while he made phone calls and checked records. Jason sat down on a bench in the lobby. People stared at him and whispered. He was now the man who claimed to be owed $35 million, the man with the old books who might actually be telling the truth. After an hour, Vance returned with two other men. One was the bank's senior legal counsel, a man named Gregory Hayes. The other was a regional director, Marcus Webb. They all looked serious and uncomfortable. They took Jason to a private conference room on the 10th floor. In the conference room, Hayes did most of the talking. He was polite but firm. He told Jason that even if the original trust agreement was legitimate, there were serious legal questions about whether it was still valid after 100 years. Banking regulations had changed. Corporate structures had changed. The bank had been sold and reorganized multiple times. Jason was ready for this argument. He pulled out more documents from his briefcase. He had copies of every corporate merger and acquisition agreement in the bank's history. He showed them the specific language that stated all existing contracts and obligations would transfer to successor entities. He had researched California banking law extensively. He knew the regulations better than they did. Hayes tried a different approach. He suggested that even if the trust was technically valid, Jason would need to prove continuous family lineage and proper inheritance. He implied this might be difficult after so many generations. Jason pulled out his family tree, professionally researched and notarized. He had birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, and probate documents going back to 1919. He was the only living direct descendant of Nathaniel Watkins. There was no question about inheritance. Webb, the regional director, then tried the diplomatic approach. He acknowledged that Jason might have a legitimate historical claim, but he suggested it would be easier for everyone if they reached a settlement. Perhaps the bank could offer Jason a reasonable payment, say $200,000, to resolve this matter quietly without expensive litigation. Jason refused. He wasn't interested in a settlement. He wanted what was legally his. The full value of the trust, which was $35 million, plus any additional interest that had accumulated since his last calculation. The three bank officials excused themselves and left Jason alone in the conference room. Through the glass wall, he could see them making urgent phone calls. This was becoming a crisis for them. $35 million was enough to hurt the bank's quarterly earnings and potentially affect stock prices. Jason understood what was happening. They were trying to figure out if his claim was real, and if so, how to make it go away with minimum cost and publicity. They were probably calling the bank's corporate headquarters, their insurance company, and their litigation team. They were treating this like a potential lawsuit that needed to be contained. But Jason had been very careful about one thing. He hadn't threatened any lawsuit. He had simply presented his documentation and asked to access his account. He was being completely reasonable and polite. This put the bank in a difficult position. If they refused to honor a legitimate trust agreement, they would be the ones violating the law, not him. After another hour, Vance returned alone. His arrogance was completely gone. He looked tired and frustrated. He told Jason that the bank was willing to investigate his claim, but it would take time. They needed to locate the original physical records from Vault Zero, which might be in storage somewhere. They needed to verify the authenticity of his documents. They needed to consult with their legal team and their regulators. Jason said he understood and was willing to be patient, but he had one condition. He wanted to be present when they opened Vault Zero and examined the original ledgers. He wanted to witness the verification process himself. Vance said that was irregular and probably not possible. Bank vaults contain confidential information about other customers. They couldn't just let civilians walk around in secure areas. Jason pointed out that he wasn't asking to see other people's records. He was asking to see his own family's records, which the bank was legally obligated to show him. If they refused, he would have grounds to suspect they were hiding or destroying evidence. This was a subtle threat, and Vance understood it. If Jason claimed the bank was obstructing his access to records, it would create legal liability. Vance said he would need to get approval from higher up the chain of command. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My father said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show him that these tales matter. Please subscribe to my channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. 3 days later, Jason received a phone call from Marcus Webb, the regional director. Webb told him they had located the original Vault Zero in the bank's basement. It hadn't been opened in over 30 years. They were willing to let Jason observe the examination of the records, but he would need to sign confidentiality agreements and be accompanied by bank security at all times. Jason agreed to the terms. They scheduled the vault opening for the following Monday morning. When Jason arrived at the bank, the atmosphere was completely different from his first visit. Security guards were waiting for him at the entrance. They escorted him through the lobby, where employees stared at him with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. Word had spread throughout the bank about the historian with the $35 million claim. They took him down to the basement, which was nothing like the fancy lobby upstairs. It was concrete and fluorescent lights, with pipes running along the ceiling and the smell of dust and old paper. They walked through several corridors until they reached a heavy steel door marked V0. Webb was there, along with his lawyer Vance and 2 security guards. There was also a bank archivist, an older woman named Dorothy Chun, who specialized in historical records. And there were 2 people Jason didn't recognize, technicians from a digital security company. Webb explained that Vault Zero contained the bank's oldest physical records, some dating back to the founding in 1919. But the vault also had an electronic access system that had been installed in the 1980s when the bank upgraded its security. The problem was that nobody had accessed the vault since then, and the system was using obsolete technology that was no longer compatible with the bank's current network. The technicians were there to bypass the electronic lock and open the vault manually. This would take some time and technical expertise. Webb seemed nervous about it. He mentioned several times that they needed to be careful not to damage any historical documents or trigger any fail-safe mechanisms that might lock the vault permanently. Jason watched as the technicians worked. They had laptops and specialized equipment. They were trying to interface with a security system from the 1980s, which meant dealing with floppy disks and outdated encryption protocols. The work was slow and frustrating. After 2 hours, one of the technicians said they had a problem. The vault's electronic system wasn't just locked. It was running some kind of protocol they'd never seen before. It appeared to be waiting for specific input, like a password or authentication code. Without that input, they couldn't bypass the lock without potentially destroying the mechanism. Hayes asked if there was any documentation about this protocol. Dorothy Chun, the archivist, said she would check the bank's old technical manuals, but she wasn't optimistic. The system was so old that most of the documentation had probably been thrown away decades ago. That's when Jason remembered something. He opened his briefcase and took out the founder's seal, the brass medallion Vance had mocked during his first visit. He told them that according to his great-grandfather's notes, the seal wasn't just a symbol. It was also a physical key. The protocol they were seeing might be the founder's authentication system. The technicians looked at the seal skeptically. It was just a piece of brass with engravings. How could that interface with an electronic lock from the 1980s? But Dorothy Chin understood. She explained that in the early days of electronic security, some systems used physical tokens with embedded RFID chips or magnetic strips. The seal might contain such technology, even though it looked like a simple medallion. They decided to try it. One of the technicians examined the vault door more carefully and found a small circular indentation near the electronic keypad. It was exactly the size of the founder's seal. Jason placed the seal into the indentation. For a moment, nothing happened. Then there was a soft beep. The lights in the basement flickered. The technicians' laptops displayed error messages and then went blank. Everyone froze. Then the massive steel door of Vault Zero began to move. Ancient hydraulics hissed and groaned. The door swung open slowly, revealing darkness inside. The air that came out smelled like old paper and metal and time. But something else happened too. The technicians' laptops suddenly came back on, and they weren't showing error messages anymore. They were showing a display that none of them had seen before, an old computer interface from the 1980s, with green text on a black screen. The text said, Protocol Zero initiated. Authenticating founder credentials. Nathaniel Watkins family line confirmed. Accessing Eternal Trust account 00-0000-1847. Then numbers appeared on the screen. Current balance, $35,127,000, gold equivalent. Status, active, awaiting disbursement instructions. Everyone stared at the screen in stunned silence. The account was real. The $35 million was real. Jason's entire claim was verified in an instant by the bank's own ancient security system. But the display wasn't finished. More text appeared. Warning, original charter obligations detected. Watkins family retains founding authority as per 1919 agreement. Current corporate structure operating under conditional license granted by founding parties. Hayes, the lawyer, went pale. What does that mean? He whispered. Jason knew exactly what it meant. He had read the original 1919 charter documents. His great-grandfather hadn't just invested in the bank. He had been one of its two founders. And according to the original agreement, the Watkins family retained certain permanent rights, including the ability to review and approve major corporate decisions. Webb, the regional director, was already on his phone, frantically calling the corporate headquarters. This was bigger than a $35 million account. This was about the fundamental legal structure of the entire bank. Vance looked like he might be sick. The man who had mocked Jason and laughed at his antique documents was now realizing that those documents represented real power, power that had been sleeping for 100 years, but was still legally binding. Jason didn't gloat. He simply walked into Vault Zero and began examining the original ledgers with Dorothy Chen's help. The vault contained rows of old filing cabinets and storage boxes, all filled with documents from the bank's first decades. And there, in the very first cabinet, was the original Watkins Trust Agreement, written in his great-grandfather's handwriting, exactly matching the certified copy Jason had brought. The discovery in Vault Zero triggered a crisis at Meridian Financial. Within hours, the CEO and several board members arrived from the corporate headquarters in New York. They held emergency meetings with their legal team, their auditors, and their financial advisors. The question wasn't whether Jason's claim was legitimate. Protocol Zero had already confirmed that, but rather what other obligations and rights came with the original founding charter. Jason was invited to these meetings, though invited was perhaps too gentle a word. The bank needed him there because he was the only person who had thoroughly researched the historical documents. He knew things about the bank's legal foundation that their own lawyers didn't know. Over the next week, Jason explained the full scope of the 1919 founding agreement. Nathaniel Watkins and Robert Meridian had created the bank as equal partners. However, the Watkins family had provided the majority of the initial capital, the gold reserves that kept the bank alive during the Depression. In exchange for this capital, the agreement included several provisions that were supposed to last forever. First, there was the Eternal Trust, the $35 million that Jason was claiming. That was straightforward. Second, there was a founding authority clause. This gave the Watkins family permanent oversight rights. They could review major corporate decisions, approve or reject mergers and acquisitions, and ensure the bank operated in accordance with its original mission. Third, and most important, there was the charter recall provision. If the bank ever strayed too far from its founding principles, if it engaged in reckless practices, abused customers, or operated in bad faith, the Watkins family could invoke a recall. This would essentially revoke the bank's operating license and force a restructuring. The corporate lawyers argued that these provisions couldn't possibly still be valid. Too much time had passed. Too many laws had changed. The bank had been reorganized so many times that the original charter was effectively obsolete. But Jason had done his homework. He showed them how each subsequent merger and reorganization agreement had explicitly preserved all existing contractual obligations and founding principles. The lawyers who had drafted those agreements probably never realized what they were preserving, but the language was clear and binding. The CEO, a woman named Patricia Blackwood, was pragmatic. She understood that fighting Jason in court would be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially disastrous for the bank's reputation. The story was already leaking to press. Historian discovers he owns piece of major bank made for great headlines. Blackwood proposed a deal. The bank would pay Jason the $35 million from the trust, no questions asked. In exchange, Jason would relinquish all other rights under the founding charter, including the founding authority and charter recall provisions. Essentially, they would buy out his family's permanent oversight role. Jason considered this carefully. $35 million was life-changing money. He could retire, travel, fund his research forever. It was tempting. But then he thought about why he had started this quest in the first place. It wasn't really about the money. It was about historical justice. It was about proving that the past mattered, that traditions had value, that foundation shouldn't be forgotten or dismissed. He had spent his whole career studying financial history, watching how modern banks had become reckless and detached from their original purposes. They had caused economic crises through greed and short-term thinking. They had forgotten the principles that made banking a respectable profession. His great-grandfather had built Meridian Bank to serve the community, to provide stable financial services, to help ordinary people save and invest. That mission had been lost over the decades as the bank chased profits and market share. Jason made a counteroffer. He would accept the $35 million from the trust, but he wouldn't relinquish the founding authority or charter recall provisions. Instead, he would exercise those provisions to make changes. First, he wanted Sterling Vance reassigned, not fired. Jason wasn't cruel, but reassigned to a position where he would learn humility and respect for the bank's history. Jason suggested that Vance spend the next year working in the archives with Dorothy Chun, manually digitizing the old ledgers and learning the bank's true foundations. Second, he wanted the bank to create a historical compliance office. This office would ensure that modern banking practices didn't violate the original founding principles. It would have the authority to review major decisions and flag anything that seemed reckless or contrary to the bank's mission. Third, he wanted the bank to establish a financial history education program. They would fund scholarships, support academic research, and teach the next generation of bankers about the importance of stable, ethical, community-focused financial services. The board members were not happy about these demands, but they didn't have much choice. Jason held the legal authority, and fighting it would cost far more than accommodating him. Blackwood, the CEO, was shrewd enough to see an opportunity. She realized that Jason's demands could actually help the bank. In an era when banks were widely distrusted and criticized, having a genuine connection to ethical historical principles could be a marketing advantage. They could brand themselves as the bank that remembered its roots and valued stability over speculation. She accepted Jason's terms. The formal agreement took several weeks to draft and finalize. Jason worked with the bank's lawyers to ensure everything was properly documented and legally binding. He insisted on transparency. The agreement would be public record, available for anyone to examine. When the news broke fully, the media loved the story. Here was an ordinary history professor who had walked into a bank with old documents and ended up not just claiming $35 million, but actually reforming the institution from the inside. It was a modern David versus Goliath story, except David won without violence, just through knowledge, preparation, and respect for the past. Sterling Vance did indeed spend a year working in the archives. At first he was bitter and resentful, but gradually something changed. As he carefully digitized century-old ledgers, reading the careful handwritten entries from long-dead bank tellers and accountants, he began to understand something important. These people had taken their job seriously. They had seen banking as a sacred trust, a responsibility to protect people's money and help them build better lives. Modern banking with all its speed and technology and sophistication, had lost that sense of sacred responsibility. Everything had become about quarterly earnings and stock prices and shareholder value. The actual customers, the people who deposited their paychecks and saved for their children's education, had become secondary. By the time his year in the archives ended, Vance was a different person. He had learned the lesson Jason intended, that wealth is built on foundations, that history matters, that you can't truly understand where you're going unless you understand where you came from. As for Jason, he took his $35 million and did something unexpected. He used most of it to establish the Watkins Foundation for Financial Ethics, a nonprofit organization dedicated to researching and promoting ethical banking practices. He kept enough to live comfortably and continue his academic work, but he wasn't interested in luxury or extravagance. He remained involved with Meridian Financial through his founding authority role, attending quarterly meetings and reviewing major decisions. He rarely exercised his veto power, but the fact that he could keep the board honest. The bank flourished under this arrangement. Customers appreciated knowing there was someone watching over the bank who cared more about ethics than profits. Employees took pride in working for an institution with genuine historical principles. And whenever new employees joined Meridian Financial, part of their orientation included a trip down to Vault Zero, where they would see the original ledgers and hear the story of how Jason Watkins had walked into the lobby with an old briefcase and reminded everyone that the past always pays its debts. And sometimes it collects them too. This story teaches us that true value isn't always visible on the surface. What looks outdated or worthless to modern eyes may hold a foundation for everything we take for granted today. Jason's victory came not from aggression or wealth, but from patience, preparation, and respect for history. Sterling Vance learned that arrogance and dismissing the past leads to ignorance of the present, while humility and understanding where we came from gives us wisdom for where we're going. The most important lesson is this: never judge someone's work by their appearance or their methods. The quiet person with old documents might hold more power than a loud person with new technology, because real authority is built on solid foundations, not flashy surfaces. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will read this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. Kindly support what I do here by subscribing. And then drop in the comment section if you like part 2 of Jason's story. What will he do with his newfound authority over Meridian Financial? Will Sterling Vance truly change, or will he plot revenge? What other secrets lie buried in Vault Zero? Let me know if you want to hear more about the architect's next move.